Good afternoon and welcome to EarnscliffeLive webinar, The Future of ESG in Canada and Its Implications for Business and Government. My name is Naseem Ahmadi and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm a senior consultant in Earnscliffe's strategic communications practice, and I'm joining you from our Vancouver office, and I'll also be your moderator for the next hour. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleagues from across the country and a special guest who will be introducing shortly. First, my colleagues. Joining us on the panel today is Katie Shaw, who is also based here in BC. Katie is well versed in the ESG space, having worked with various sectors to advance equity-oriented policy and stakeholder engagement. Before joining Earnscliffe, Katie was an executive director with the Crown Corporation of the BC government and currently sits on the board for Equitas, an international human rights organization. Also with us is Velma McCall, who is our national marketplace lead and someone who's been working in the energy transition, climate change, and environment sectors for most of her career. She's been building bridges around ESG before it was called ESG and has professional and personal experience working on equity in gender, race, and ability. We're also joined by our Toronto colleague, Melissa Bruno, who is no stranger to social policy. Prior to joining Earnscliffe, Melissa worked for SHAD Canada, a Canadian charity and SEAM program to increase participation within underrepresented groups. And during her time as executive director for Canada's New Democrats, Melissa built one of the most inclusive slates of candidates in Canadian history. Also from Toronto is my colleague, Julie Garner, who has considerable experience with respect to governance, sitting on a number of boards. Julie holds a master's in political science from Wilfrid Laurier University and from the ISEM International School of Business and Management in France. So before I turn things over to Katie to introduce our special guest, I'd like to invite viewers to pose questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A instead of the chat. And any questions that we don't get to throughout the webinar, we'll follow up with you by email. So with that, I'll turn it over to Katie to introduce our guest.
Thank you so much, Naz. I'm very excited today to have the opportunity to speak with Tim Lesiuk, who is Assistant Deputy Minister of Investment and Innovation Division here at the BC government. He is with the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Recovery and Innovation. And I feel like we're very lucky to have you today, Tim, to help explain and talk about the leadership that the BC government is taking in this space. So to start, why don't we ask a pretty basic question, which I think a lot of people actually are going to be really interested in hearing about. Could you explain the impetus for the BC government's recent public commitment to ESG and how it links to the new economic vision for the province?
Absolutely. And thanks, Katie, for inviting me to participate in the webinar today. I'll start off with a brief acknowledgement of my own that I'm participating today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people here in British Columbia, the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations in the territory that we know as Victoria, BC. Great question. In February of this year, the provincial government in British Columbia released an economic plan that explained how their values and economic growth are aligned for them and where they want to go in the long term. And those in that economic plan, they established some long-term goals for economic growth that are inclusive and clean. And so they're looking to have an economic growth in the province of BC that matches the kind of society that British Columbians are asking them to build, and not have a gap between where we want to go with our social environmental interests and outcomes and where our economy is taking us. And I think it's been interesting working with this government to build that vision right into their economic path. In that economic plan, they have 6 missions that break down those goals into tangible outcomes that parts of government and parts of British Columbia can work towards. And each of those missions brings with it a new suite of measures. And that's where we start to see the alignment of ESG values and measures of economic growth and economic success at the provincial level. And we're still working on those measures, and we're going to keep working on those through this year. We don't think we've got the set completely right yet. And at the same time, we're building our ESG structure and organizations. Many of the ESG standards that are being assessed internationally can be met just by operating in British Columbia. And we've known that for a long time, that some of those sustainable development goals and ESG criteria are established to move all of the parts of the world in a positive environmental social governance direction. And we may already be there in many cases. When companies compete internationally that are based in British Columbia, they are meeting those ESG criteria because they operate here. And we have those high levels of expectation around the way companies engage with Indigenous peoples, around the way that the environment is affected and restored after industrial activity. Their competitors might not be. And a part of the economic plan was acknowledging that global marketplace that we play in, and the ways that we might be able to use ESG as a competitive advantage for British Columbia, instead of it being a quiet component that we're meeting in the background and leaving our companies and our products and services from BC to compete on an unlevel playing field internationally. So you're going to see British Columbia taking that ESG commitment bolted directly onto its economy and moving into the international marketplace.
Just building on that, how do you see this realignment with ESG as a priority and bolting it to that marketplace functioning to support the attraction of investment and growth in the province?
Thanks, Katie. The communication of the ESG values is still a complicated thing. And we understand that. The companies that are here in BC understand that, and across Canada. There are many standards, there are many rating agencies and organizations. Part of what we're going to do on ESG is work with the major, especially exporting sectors of British Columbia, to look at what the leading standards are in the fields where they're either attracting investment or marketing their products and services, and work with them to identify which of those metrics and which of those standards they think would be reasonable and line up with those values of the provincial government and British Columbians. That system of ESG also requires a lot of data collection. Sometimes that data isn't always transparent to folks, both users and those that are collecting it. The data can often be hard to find. And so part of our effort will be to make sure that there is transparent, reliable data that's available to folks to support those ESG claims and demonstrate that companies are meeting those ESG standards. Not everybody's perfect on day one. And we know that from the ESG disclosures that are happening. It's not about being perfect. It's about having that progress over time and clear, reliable data. And that's part of what we're going to be bringing to the marketplace through our ESG commitment in the economic plan and the establishment of an ESG organization. So it's not just the claim or a marketing tool that you're going to see. We're starting at literally the ground and working our way up to that international marketplace to try and make sure that the companies that are here are not handicapped by their commitment to strong ESG values and the obligation of the province to meet those targets in the plan.
That's great. Just building on that, how do you think the other priorities of government have helped support this next phase of ESG in a more public way for this approach?
Thanks, Katie. I think the experiences that we've had in the last 2 years, I think as a planet, all the people on the planet, as British Columbia, adding on to the pandemic and understanding of the impact on global supply chains of events around the world, the climate events that BC's experienced in the last 2 years as well, more and more clear that if we're not paying attention to the resilience of our economy and of the people in British Columbia, of the awareness of the supply chains and where products and services are coming from, who makes them, how they make them, how they get to our doorstep, where they go after this point in time. The importance of having that information in a way that we can make changes in the economy over time where we need to, and guide our investments and our policies in BC. You need all of that information to make a policy decision, just like you do to make a purchasing decision. And the government plans to use it in a very similar way. So you're going to see over time, it's not an overnight thing. And all of that information isn't available for every decision on the first day. It would be great if it was, but it's not. It's going to take some time to grow, but a commitment to looking at the programs and policies of government through the same lens. So when we've already got commitments in legislation around climate goals, we've got commitments in legislation around UNDRIP and the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and our obligations under the action plan that was recently released. More of the policies and programs of government are going to be designed to achieve, say, their primary goal, but also these additional objectives around clean, around low carbon, around Indigenous reconciliation, around co-governance with Indigenous peoples, around equity across regions in BC, across gender, and across the educational system and access to services. And more and more that's playing a role in decisions government's taking. And I think you'll see it permeate to the way government interprets existing legislation and beyond. It is a framework that's designed to bring those things together and not be a new template to fill out, but an actual way of structuring decisions and bringing these values in. And that was really also heavily influenced, I think, by the advice of Mariana Mazzucato and her team on the how, not so much the what. Their role was not to help government figure out its values and what it wants to put in the plan, but how to govern in a system that's taking these multiple values in, and then look at procurement and look at public finance and look at the way that we do the policy business of government and push our values into those systems so that we don't have part of government making significant, meaningful decisions that move us in a direction away from our long-term goals, and then a whole other part of government trying to bring us back towards them. And that's there's a new group established on my team that is helping on the governance side with the policy development and governance process inside of government that you won't see on a day-to-day basis, but whose job it is to look at those decisions of government and start to introduce more of the values and more of a longer-term economic lens into the policy decisions government makes.
That's great. Well, you guys have a very bold and ambitious mandate in front of you. It would be interesting to know, just before we wrap with our time today, what are the next steps that you see government taking and that the public and business can expect?
Thanks, Katie. I think two big pieces that may be of interest to watch for this audience around ESG. One is the evolution of those metrics, and we'll be engaging further through the spring and summer around what is the right package of metrics now to be monitoring. Not that we're not looking at GDP and jobs and the traditional, but when you want to look up, at factors beyond the traditional economic outcomes, you need additional new measures. So that's one thing to look for, and a way for folks to engage is going to be around the metrics and a dashboard that we can use to effectively track the decision making of government over time. The second is the development of the ESG organization, and that's going to happen also this year. There'll be some engagement happening this spring and into the summer around the design and the structure And then likely the organization will follow up with more of that direct engagement with business, with communities, with Indigenous communities across the province around the standards. So those are coming in the next year to 18 months to look at how to build the credibility of that entity and of the claims BC wants to make on the international marketplace.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you coming today. And again, congratulations on all the work. And there's a long path ahead, but we're looking forward to learning more and being part of that as you go.
Great. Thank you all. Happy to be here. And thanks for inviting me again to talk more about BC's economic plan.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. And thanks, Katie, for setting the stage for the discussion. To kick things off with the Earnscliffe panel, I'd like to first ask Velma for an overview of the E of ESG environment. What really stands out to you as being most important?
Thanks, Naseem. And it was interesting to hear Tim's take, because BC is taking this fantastic leadership role in bringing these global norms, because we are talking about global norms across E, S, and G into Canada, and the legislative framework makes a big stride in that direction. So on the environment side, this is a continuation of a discussion that has happened. We have called it sustainability or corporate social responsibility. We've seen reports out, and we've seen global standards in this area for a long time. I think what's interesting now is that we're seeing a convergence of these three agendas together. And on climate change in particular, we see a little bit in nature and circular economy, but in climate in particular, we're seeing the connection of capital markets to these values. And so everyone is aware of the Paris Agreement signed in 2015, but in Glasgow, the global financial markets set out a plan for net zero that would see $130 trillion in assets moved in the direction of a net zero economy by 2050. That was an initiative led by financial markets. And so that changes the conversation with governments. And I think it's part of the reason why you hear an economic department of the BC government talking about their economic strategy and why these three areas are important, because they believe that it will attract capital for projects, not just for their companies, but for infrastructure that they want to build across their province. The other thing I think that kind of puts this into with some new momentum is that this now matters to consumers, it matters to shareholders, it matters to investors, capital markets, governments, NGOs. I mean, this has got traction in a number of different areas. So people, companies, organizations are understanding that they're going to be measured in a number of different directions, and that they need to have an integrated E, S, and G story. So it's not just enough to have an environmental report anymore. You have a much bigger story that you need to tell. So I think it's really, on the environmental side, it's always been a risk management piece. But I think now it's broadened. So that's the take on the E side. So much more to say, but I turn it back to you, Naseem.
And I'm sure you'll have more to share later on the panel. So shifting from E to S, Melissa, same question to you. For the social component, what are the core elements?
Yeah, so the social component is a measure of a company's people and community-oriented projects. I think the most common elements of an S program that you'll find are things around human rights, labor practices and HR policies, pay transparency, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, employee engagement. And now, because of the pandemic, there is an increased focus on remote work arrangements, as well as mental health and wellness support programs. The social practice sort of sounds obvious, but oftentimes the rollout isn't. And an example I can use is an organization might take into consideration the need to make religious accommodations for their employees. We'll take Ramadan as an example. The lifestyle and work style of some employees who are fasting during the day will obviously be affected. So, creating, for example, areas for people to practice their faith might actually only be one piece of the pie. Another example we can use, again, in the context of the pandemic, is for employees who have a disability that's not necessarily visible. They may thrive in a work from home model because they can control noise, they can control the lighting, the temperature. All of these things are otherwise outside the control in an office environment, but they may very well impact their performance. I think historically, the S practice has been sort of the lowest regarded within the broader ESG framework. But now, following the pandemic and various workplace COVID-19 outbreaks, there's been several high-profile racial injustices that we've all been watching here in Canada. You can see that there's a level of protest quickly spreading globally. And so I think the S factor is now starting to get some much deserved attention. And I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, a lot of S examples that wouldn't have necessarily immediately come to mind. That was really helpful. And Julie, would you be able to share your thoughts on the G, governance, and what you see as the key considerations there?
Yeah, the G, for instance, is governance factors of decision making, really simply put. And in the public sector and private sector, there's been increased pressure for governments and private companies to really put their money and their policies where their mouth is with respect to layering in the values of E and S into their decision making. What I see really interesting in this is that it's a very fast moving space and there isn't kind of global standards, and there can be winners and losers picked, especially on the climate front and the technology front in the G space, depending on what factors are applied in that decision making. So it's really important as we look at the G and we assess how it's being applied in the public sector across governments, as well in the private sector, is to understand kind of what options are available and really consult and understand that how is important, the what, and the how is important, but also ensuring that we're not picking winners and losers when there's viable options available. Similar to kind of Melissa's point, great intentions, but bad results in terms of disturbing the markets.
Right, and in a way, the G helps thread the E, S, and G together and how an organization operates with those values. Yeah. So Melissa, do you have any questions from the viewers that you'd like to flag for the panel?
Yeah, I do. Here is a good one. So Velma mentioned global standards for ESG. Could there come a time when Canada signs on to broadly based international agreements writ large relating to ESG?
I think that's a possibility. We adhere loosely to a number of global standards. Our companies do, or our governments do, UN standards, technical standards, ISO standards. There's a lot out there. And I think part of what companies are challenged by is what's the right standard? And it's not just a matter of technical data here. I think people will pick a lane and meet a public standard. But I think it'll take a while before will ever be in a universally true ESG standard. It's also part of the reason why BC's initiative is so interesting, because they're basically saying we're going to get ahead of this, and before the planet, global standards come to us, we'll define and root this in our own systems and go forward from there. So BC, I'm sure, will inform other governments across the country and the federal government.
One thing that I found really interesting in preparation for this webinar and doing other reading is just that the trust factor too. While we may sign on to global standards, there is going to be a tension there in terms of what people's judgment calls are, and especially in the investor world, what judgment calls there are in terms of what is good behavior from a company. And seeing that kind of net out against kind of directions that a particular government will take will be an interesting evolution.
Yeah, just one final point. It is interesting, but a lot of private equity is also starting to say what standards they want companies that are coming to them to meet. So it depends what you're motivated by.
And Melissa, is there one more question you wanted to share?
Sure. How far ahead of the rest of the country is BC and its government when it comes to ESG?
They're the only jurisdiction in the country with a legislative framework, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I would say it's also rolling up a few legislative frameworks. So I think that's actually going to be one of the more complex pieces of this for BC, because it's not necessarily one ESG legislative framework. We've got DRIPA, we've got the Clean BC roadmap, we've got new legislation that's going to come around capital asset management, and they're trying to embed these ESG commitments throughout those. Now, it's interesting, it kind of goes back to that question that you just asked in terms of, will there be something that everyone's signing on to? I mean, there's still a question on how BC is going to actually legislate the E, the S, the G. Is it going to be all together, or are they going to keep it in these different buckets? And what makes sense in terms of the system that they have to implement it?
So we'll go back to viewer questions later in the webinar, but a reminder to all viewers to put your questions in the Q&A chat and we'll get to them. So Katie, in your interview with Tim off the top, there was a lot to think about in terms of the many facets of ESG. So I was wondering if you could help us take a step back and see the big picture in terms of the feasibility of considering environment, social, and governance issues all within one basket. Some might say we're talking about apples, oranges, and lemons. How, in your view, do these all hang together?
Well, I don't think there's a really clear picture on exactly what that framework is going to look like. And I think the reality is that, like Tim said, they are still in development of what those metrics and those measurement tools are going to be. And ultimately, the largest challenge for government right now in BC is how they're going to be able to engage stakeholders along the journey. And that doesn't mean just stakeholders in the business community or in the technology and innovation sector, for example, that are helping, decrease emissions on a daily basis. This is also an equity question in terms of who has access to participate in defining what counts. Ultimately, if you're not counting it, it's not going to count. So this ESG framework is going to require a pretty robust engagement process. And I don't think we actually have anything to compare it to as completely as they're trying to do with this work. And I'm interested to see where the ESG Center of Excellence, or the organization that they put forward, and it's exciting to hear that they're going to be doing engagement. And hopefully they'll be taking into account that question of equity. Who has access to engage? How much are they able to engage? And what capacity do they need support with to engage in a meaningful way?
Great. And Alma, some might say that ESG could be seen purely as an investment lens, or do you think there's a possibility of an emerging compliance regime that will involve government and business?
So that it's an interesting question. Let me answer that in two parts. On the compliance question, I think the whole rise of capital markets in environmental, climate, nature, etc. issues means that we're moving beyond compliance. So, and by that I mean environmental regulatory compliance. So we've moved beyond that. And the question is whether governments will also then set standards. I think they're more likely to be tracking reporting than they are to put themselves again in another additional regulation. I think there's enough happening. There are other factors beyond government. So I don't think it's a regulatory role, but it is a public reporting, public accountability role. And you've seen them do that in, I think, a couple of of areas. They did that around corporate boards in making sure that there was gender diversity, and there's starting to be racial diversity in corporate boards in Canada. And then the second thing is in the budget, they have put forward new rules for federally regulated industries that said that they must have climate disclosure, which is just meeting a global standard. But by taking that step, they're saying, hey, we're paying attention. We need to see how you're doing in these areas. So yes, some regulation, but it's not going to be an overly regulatory piece. It's going to be more public reporting and tracking.
And then in terms of the investment lens question.
And on investment, I think you see it reflected in new pockets of funding, particularly around infrastructure federally, whether that's at the Canada Infrastructure Bank or with the Net Zero Accelerator, or what will come with the new growth fund. Lenses about meeting public targets will be applied before infrastructure dollars or program dollars are flow. So on the government side, it certainly applies. And then, as I said, you see people like BlackRock and other private equity firms basically saying, in order to have us invest in your company or your technology, you have to meet these standards before you can even walk in the door.
And Julie, Velma's discussing the public accountability role of ESG. So how should businesses approach ESG when it comes to issues like reputation management, risk mitigation, and public policy advocacy?
Thanks very much for the question, Naz. Really, when it comes to reputation, the corporate social responsibility was kind of initially a PR, and certainly it had some genuine elements to it, but it was really important at that time to really know what you were doing and how you were doing it. And a lot of that really led to great reputation management. But now it's gone far more operational and as you mentioned, kind of risk associated, because there can be disruptive factors if governments make choices, for instance, to only do business with or women in diverse owned companies, which would be a wonderful thing to consider as a factor, and many private corporations, especially in the US, are, then it certainly can change what opportunities are going to be available for you in an organization. We've seen it in, as Velma was mentioning, in construction. We've seen it for the last kind of 10 years where governments have been layering on criteria within the award of contract that require the hiring of disadvantaged groups or underrepresented groups within construction associated with the award of that contract. These are really wonderfully aimed policy layers, but for a company that isn't actually active in supporting diverse or underrepresented groups within society, you're going to be at a competitive advantage. So really, from an operational standpoint, it's actually living this truth of environmental social governance within your organization, really embracing it and understanding that it is, as Tim said, a competitive advantage for you that's going to open up opportunities, in particular with governments as they move into these spaces and look at zero emissions technologies and selecting out against companies that aren't disclosing their climate records. So you've got to really, from an operational standpoint, layer it throughout the organization. It's no longer just important to kind of talk about it and have some really good proof points. It's really got to be part of your DNA.
Right. And Melissa, on Julie's points around the social policy issues of business operations, ESG would understandably have implications to the cost of capital, workforce attraction, retention, branding, and environmental and corporate sustainability. So how can this all lead to value creation?
I think historically, the social element of ESG has been the most difficult to assess. Social issues are, less tangible, which means there's less data to show how a company's performance can be impacted. But social issues can impact a company's financial performance, particularly if companies fail to address them. And that inaction can have a downward impact on a company's share value and the overall perception in the marketplace. Consumers and ESG-minded investors as my colleagues have pointed out, are starting to use key criteria, specifically S criteria, when they decide what companies they're willing to invest in. And some of the research and questions that are being asked of these companies are, what are their hiring practices? Do they have a diverse workforce? Do they have ethical and diverse supply chain vendors? In a geopolitical context, what is their public position on various social justice issues? I think the bottom line is that people are increasingly expecting companies and those that are investing in them to make decisions that will have a positive social impact in their communities. And for businesses, there's a strong incentive to get these sorts of things right. I think, we're seeing in a current labor shortage, there's a clear war for talent. Job seekers have the upper hand in choosing employers, the type of jobs, the working conditions that they're a part of. There's a newer generation entering the workforce that are extremely focused on finding work that has, a higher meaning or purpose that they can really get behind. So I think there's a clear value add on the economic side for companies in terms of the cost of employee retention versus training and hiring new people. And so, that can mean even the smallest of investments in productivity, satisfaction, and retention may well be very worth it.
And Naseem, can I just build on Melissa for 1 second? Because I think this intergenerational point is very important because it also goes to the motivation of many corporations, especially those that are consumer oriented and targeting a younger market. They know that their consumers are looking, as Melissa said, very tangibly for an expression of social and public good in their corporate objectives. And it's just a business reality now for many, many, many corporations. It's also shareholder activism, employee activism. These kinds of things are part of the pressure, the pain points that are changing our public dialogue on this, because this has moved a lot in the last 10 years. So just a real point that this is just a recognition of the facts about where the next generation of consumers, public office holders, shareholders, buyers are going to be coming from, and they will be asking all of us those questions.
If I could layer in a real world example that came, I was in a board meeting today with an insurance company that I sit on, and we were talking, and we've talked at length about how the community support is the driving factor for talent attraction within the company. Insurance is not a sexy industry, but at the same time, when folks come to interview, it's number one, the community support and the investments that the company has made within communities to change lives that they cite as being the reason that they're sitting in the chair and looking at the opportunity.
Yeah, it's a deciding factor all across the board.
Mm-hmm.
Katie, your conversation with Tim provided us an example of how governments are increasingly turning their attention to ESG as well. So how do you see this changing with time, particularly with governments that might think this constitutes unnecessary red tape?
Well, I think the main message we always hear is, more regulation is not good for business. I would turn that around and say that this is maybe an opportunity to rethink the type of regulation that government could be putting in place to actually enable more economic development versus stifle it. And I think that overall, this is not a linear path. This is not going to be a process that has an easy to do workbook. People are really going to have to come to the table and be collaborative in a real meaningful way. And that means including voices that otherwise they may not have included in the past. And it's not a fad. This isn't going anywhere. And I think that the differentiator between maybe other initiatives that have tried and tried with with big ambitions to include the S more and include the G more, whether that's corporate social responsibility or through their shared value proposition. The reality is now the markets are investing in this. There's money behind this. This is, this is a differentiator. And then you layer on top of that these global events that we are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, whether it's the heat dome here in BC or the atmospheric river, which I didn't even know was a terminology until recently, and now it's on the tip of everybody's tongue. All of these things are happening to us in a daily lived way, not to mention the pandemic we've been in. So couple all of this together, whether or not we see this as an opportunity or a hindrance, the reality is it's here. And I think the real question is, how do we work with governments to create enabling regulatory environments and a process that enables business to really profile the great work that they are doing through that transparency and that radical disclosure, through the dashboard, for example, that Tim brought up that they're working towards, so that they can use this as the competitive advantage.
Absolutely. There's lots of examples of companies doing good because it's good for business, regardless of the reporting regime. Yeah, Melissa, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Nassim, just let me, because this is so much a case of people being able to tell their story. They don't necessarily put these things all together in one package. They think that there are different audiences for that. And this is where I was talking about convergence. The convergence is it's one package of information that you're communicating out. And so, for us, we're finding that public opinion research is useful for organizations, or tune up to their communications approach is important in just maybe gathering into one bucket, as you said earlier, or one pile, all of the things that they're doing, because we find often that people have very strong stories. They're just not telling them as comprehensively, and some don't even understand that they needed to tell them comprehensively.
Melissa, do you have any questions from the viewers?
I do. I have a good one. How do you see UNDRIP commitments provincially and federally playing out in relation to governance standards?
I can take the first stab at that. So in BC, we have the legislation of DRIPA, and part of that requires an action plan to be reported on an annual basis. This is another example of a non-linear process, and it's another example of us all as Canadians having to come to a point of not just reconciliation, but a point of being prepared to come to the table in a different way. And co-decision making, co-management, these are all words that are being used, but how they're actually defined and put into practice, that's really needs to be co-developed in a very meaningful way. And so part of that is taking the commitment at a high level in terms of legislation and supporting government's efforts to build the types of relationships and pathways that enable those discussions to be meaningful and meet the commitments of UNDRIP across the board. Now, the ESG framework in BC, whatever that looks like, will have to come with DRIPA at the forefront. This is not something that'll be on the side. It'll not sit in one bucket or the other. This will cross sector the E, the S, and the G as it should. And I don't have the answer to everything here, but I will say that it is not going to be linear. There needs to be patience and there needs to be collaboration.
Yeah, and federally, we passed legislation in June of last year related to UNDRIP, and the government is working on its implementation. So there are legislative frameworks for this, and it's the how. I think that's next, and we're seeing Indigenous organizations take this as take a different approach. Like I'm reminded of the Indigenomics conference that's coming up in BC in May, and the Indigenous community is stepping forward and saying there is $100 billion Indigenous economy across all of these areas that Indigenous people intend to lead in Canada. And so when you talk about enabling legislation, we need enabling conversations with the Indigenous community, because they are changing the nature of the conversation. They are leading their own initiatives, their own economic strategies, their own plans. And the question is, how are others across the country going to be stepping up and partnering with them? So again, I think this is not simply about compliance. It's not about a compliance framework that will be passed down in legislation. It's an opportunity to step forward in partnership with the Indigenous community.
Thank you. And Melissa, do you have another question?
Sure, let me see here. Should business be concerned that ESG is effectively licensed for governments to add additional layers of regulation in multiple areas? I see Velma smiling.
Well, I think this is where we sort of have to challenge historic thinking, because we tend to look at these kinds of things as being only about government regulating behavior in business. And the thing that's fascinating and a big change, as I said, from a decade ago, is that it's capital markets that are driving this behavior as much as it is government. And so it's not simply a matter of government, as we tend to say, sitting off in an ivory tower and coming up with some rules. We have a number of factors in society and in our public economies that are saying things need to change. And so I think it's the case that business, and there are plenty of good examples of people who are doing it, they need to be nimble in responding to all of those factors. This isn't government-led alone. We've seen a tipping point in climate change in the last 7 years on this, and it's coming in other areas as well.
Yeah, Naz, if I could just jump in, I think Velma's bang on there that it isn't just kind of one thing. It's consumers that are driving, it's investors that are driving, and then it's governments that are layering on to support their objectives for climate, for social. And the layers that they're putting on are also, as Tim mentioned earlier, creating potentially competitive advantage. Governments want to attract sustainable businesses, and those businesses are driven by consumers. If those consumers are choosing these types of companies, then they're basically helping to support the winners in our economy. And so, yes, the what, I saw a question in the chat in terms, or the question that you just asked in terms of layering on layers of red tape is certainly a concern, but that red tape, if it's well-intentioned and done properly, will actually help create, I think, stronger economies that are supported by sustainable businesses that help us achieve our environmental and social goals.
Yeah, I think Katie gave us good language too, enabling versus restricting or stopping, right? And that is a shift. Not all governments are good at that. And I mean that anywhere in the world, and especially, it's also true. The other thing is that municipalities, I just want to give a shout out for municipal governments here, because they are often very creative about many of these factors, because they live it in a closer way than a federal government can sometimes, and their solutioning in these areas is often more nimble and quicker.
So on the theme of stakeholders that might be less than enthusiastic about embracing ESG, a two-part question for all the panelists. First, what would you say to potential critics who still view ESG as potentially a passing fad or greenwashing? And secondly, how do we reconcile the differing approaches to reporting requirements? So I'll start with Velma.
So I'll start with the second question. In terms of the technical requirements, I would just be looking for something that is endorsed broadly. There are often sector-wide standards or national standards or provincial standards, something which has some sort of, pardon, I can't think of a better phrase, but good housekeeping seal of approval to it, so that you understand that you're being judged by peers and by external factors. So the reporting environment is very complicated, and it really requires a tailored approach. Remind me the first part of your question.
Around critics who might see this as greenwashing or a passing fad.
I think it's going to be criticized. I mean, I think everybody's going to look at it, but it is a global norm. There's no this is not going away. As I said, it's an intergenerational issue. If we think we're going to duck for a year or two because standards might change, that's fine. But intergenerationally, it's not going away. It's a standard, and as a mother, I know it's a standard my daughter expects me to live up to, and that she'll certainly be voting for and voting with her feet as an employee, and voting with her dollars as an investor. So people respond to public pressures, and I think this is another reason why we know it's not going away.
Julie, what do you think?
I liked what you asked in terms of what would you say, and I would just say do some research on what's going on in your own company, what your consumers, what your employees, what your stakeholders want, and then base your decisions on whether or not this is a passing fad or something that's actually driven by needs out there in the marketplace. Ask them what they think of you and how you're behaving corporately, and I think there'll be some really interesting answers. The public opinion research that we've done at Earnscliffe for our clients has been astounding in terms of revealing competitive advantages within a company, where to isolate, where to focus, but it's also, I think, helped shape that perception around ESG and its longevity.
Melissa, what do you have to add?
I think around the differing approaches, I think sometimes what can happen is it alters the narrative in a story a company is trying to tell its consumers. And, to Julie's point, that's why it's so important to invest in research and understand how you're perceived by your audience and the overall perception in the marketplace. It's been, I think, clearly said that we've moved away from approaching ESG, specifically the S bucket, as a sort of checklist. A good social performance for companies can often set the stage for a strong and compelling public narrative that quite literally translates into several benefits, from better relationships with local communities to improved business performances. So I think in terms of the business case for integrating social issues, it's pretty clear. We've seen companies' supply chains are less likely to be stable if it has poor labor practices and human rights violations. As I mentioned, from an operational perspective, performance may be negatively impacted by increased worker turnover. So, by effectively managing these issues, companies can avoid these risks.
Katie, your thoughts?
Well, I think, from a high level perspective and overall, the past two and a bit years, I think has really forced many people to step back and figure out different ways that all of these elements that we thought were siloed and happening independently are actually connected. And this is the essence of the E, the S, the G, the integration across all of them, is how, building an ecosystem that interconnects things and people and processes and investment in ways that actually work towards a purpose that people want to see happen and how they're going to use their dollars. That's essential. And I don't think that people can stop connecting the dots anymore. And a really good example started even here in BC in 2017 when the NDP first came into power. They really began a very important conversation on changing the way that we look at childcare in this province. And now that is a national issue. And childcare is not just a women's issue. This is an economic issue. This impacts our ability to grow, to attract, to retain skilled workers, to build innovation and investment. And I think that's just one very small example of how we are connecting things that we never did before. And ESG is an opportunity to do that. I don't think that we have to look at it as a hindrance, but I do think it's change, and change can be very challenging and change can feel scary, but it's also an opportunity. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in terms of how every sector can help shape the work that's coming ahead and bring your best practices forward. I mean, nobody's got a roadmap for this. Nobody's got the linear path, as we've all discussed. Everyone's doing their best in many, many ways. And I think the more we can collectively share those best practices and build on them, then the metrics will fall into place that are practical.
And I'm mindful of the time, so I have just one last question for each panelist. What will you be watching for as ESG evolves? So I'll go to Katie again.
Well, I'm very interested in how stakeholders are actually going to be engaged in this overall process, whether that's through the markets, with investors, with business, with community, with government at all levels. I think there's a real need to start defining and living what meaningful engagement looks like and what that actually means to take different perspectives and work towards solutions together. I don't think that we're going to be able to do this effectively unless we can meaningfully engage across the sectors.
Melissa?
I mean, I think what I'm looking forward to is, as we've established, ESG is here to stay. The conversation, I think, has quickly changed to more than just ESG scores. And now I think we're going to continue to see more in terms of strong and deliberate government and regulatory action to enforce standards.
Velma, your thoughts?
I'm going to be watching to see how the convergence of all of these factors accelerates outcomes, because that's what I believe will happen, is that as we start to put all these things together, we're going to start to see stronger outcomes in a number of areas. And I know that in particular in climate and the energy transition, with a 2030 target ahead of us and the reductions that are on our path, we need that accelerating action of the convergence to hit those goals. So that's what I'm going to be watching for.
And last word to you, Julie.
Well, I'll say one of the things that I'm going to be watching for is how the provinces and the federal government work together to try and create some standardization around climate disclosure and other issues in this space, to give business and other organizations that consistency they so desperately want and need. There's an appetite to move forward, but not 50 different ways. So I'll be looking to see how collaboratively the stakeholders work together in the government space, and then advocating obviously on behalf of our clients for that consistency and harmonization.
Great. Well, thank you all for your time and insights, and an extra thank you to our special guest, Tim Lesiuk, for this engaging conversation. Thank you to the viewers for your interest in ESG. We'll be sending a link to the webinar recording to all of you after this session, which you're welcome to share. And the next EarnscliffeLive webinar is Friday, April 29th at 12 Eastern, 9 Pacific. It'll be on the Ontario budget that's going to be released on Thursday next week, and on the Ontario election campaign to follow. So tune into that and have a wonderful afternoon.